Welcome to our channel. The LaLaurie Mansion in the heart of New Orleans is infamous for its ties to Madame Delphine LaLaurie, a socialite whose cruel acts have left an indelible mark on this historic building. Join us as we explore the mansion's spine-tingling tales of horror, its architectural beauty, and its reputation as one of the most haunted places in America. Whether you're a true crime enthusiast, a history buff, or simply in search of some ghostly intrigue, this video will take you on a thrilling journey through one of the most eerie locations in New Orleans. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more captivating stories from the world of the supernatural. Now check your doors, get your flashlight, and let's get started. At 1140 Royal Street stands what has become of the legendary LaLaurie Mansion, where many of New Orleans' most phantasmic poltergeists reside. Madame LaLaurie was born Marie Delphine McCarty on March 19, 1787, to a wealthy family in New Orleans. The McCarty men had military backgrounds, most were landowners, and her father, Louis Barthélemy de Macarty, was knighted as the Chevalier of the Royal and Military Order of St. Louis. By 1794, her family had a 1,344 acres plantation between Bartholomew and Independence, backing up to St. Claude Avenue, and next door to the famously wealthy Count Pierre-Philippe Mandeville de Marigny. One could safely assume she led a charmed life. Her mother was known to be quite the hostess. She loved having parties. Some nights included jumping into the canal on their property and stealing the clothes and shoes of the male guests, forcing them to go home in bare feet and nightshirts. She loved a good party and a good prank. Marie Delphine was barely 14 when she married her first husband, the 35-year-old widow, Ramon López y Angulo de la Candelaria. Ramon was an officer of the Spanish crown and second in command to the Louisiana governor. He had recently lost his wife on the treacherous and cruel voyage from Spain to Louisiana to step into his appointed position. He and Delphine were married by the bishop in a private ceremony on June 11, 1800. 5 years later, Ramon made Delphine a mother and a widow. It seems Ramon wasn't thrilled with the crown. Perhaps he harbored some bitterness and blame with the death of his previous wife. There is a record of him saying that they were sent over from Spain at the worst time of the year. Had they postponed their voyage 1 month as he requested, his wife's life could have been spared in a less grueling voyage. And with the bitterness came a bit of rebellion in his role. Ramon angered Spain for the last time when he opened up the importation of captives directly from Africa, defying the orders that Spain had implemented. The orders prohibited the importation until hostilities had settled and had become a more peaceful environment in the human trafficking trade. It is also speculated that Spain reprimanded him for marrying without permission. The crown he served began shuffling him around the globe, removing him from his prominent position. After many efforts by way of letter writing and supposedly a visit to the Queen by Delphine, he was pardoned and appointed Spanish consul to New Orleans under the American administration. At this time, Delphine was pregnant and waiting for him in Havana so they could return to New Orleans together. Ramon boarded a ship in Bordeaux to make his way back to his expecting wife. On January 11, 1805, his vessel hit a sandbar off the shores of Havana, and Ramon was killed. Around this same time, Delphine gave birth to their daughter, Marie Delphine Francisca Borja López y Angulo de la Candelaria. The baby girl was named in part after Ramon's dead wife. Delphine stayed in Havana long enough to bury her husband and have her daughter baptized. She then returned to her home in New Orleans, a young widow and mother, to discover that New Orleans was no longer under Spanish or French rule, but now under American ownership. The young widow would soon be married again. On Delphine's 20th birthday, March 19, 1807, and just a few weeks after her mother died, she married an older Frenchman and widower, Jean-Paul Blanc. Delphine's mother had divided her estate between her 3 children. Blanc was a savvy businessman. Perhaps he saw her inheritance as an opportunity. Jean-Paul Blanc had arrived in New Orleans with an agenda. He was a ruthless businessman who had been active in the slave trade as well as politics, and an associate to the notorious pirate brothers Jean and Pierre Lafitte. Delphine's inheritance of $33,007 made for a healthy dowry for the marriage to her new husband. Her mother also left her a downtown plantation on the bank of the Mississippi River, 52 slaves, and livestock and farm equipment. Her father gifted Delphine and Blanc another plantation, property on Chartres Street, and an additional 26 slaves. In today's value, her inheritance was worth over $2 million. Blanc went on to purchase a 2-story townhome on Royal and Conti, next door to the Bank of Louisiana, where he was the director. By 1815, they had 5 children, the eldest being the daughter of Delphine's first husband. The family would split their time between the townhome and their plantation. Delphine and Blanc had secured a privileged life for themselves. But things are not always as they seem. Less than a year after the Battle of New Orleans, the 50-year-old Jean Blanc passed away. Delphine, just 28 years old, was left to settle Blanc's estate. His estate consisted of debts that totaled over $160,000, over $2.5 million in today's currency. In 1816, Delphine renounced their community property to the courts and forfeited all of their mutual assets to protect and keep hers. Over the next 10 years, Delphine auctioned off much of Blanc's property, including enslaved people, to try and pay off his debts. She even purchased one piece of his property herself at auction, as well as retaining some of his slaves. Records showed that 8 of the enslaved people she now owned died in a span of about 5 years. Most were children or women of childbearing age. The causes of death are unknown. The debt that Blanc left behind could have depleted LaLaurie's wealth. Delphine had the luck of the Irish, though it came in the form of morbid and macabre luck. Her father, Chevalier Louis Barthélemy de Macarty, passed away in 1824, leaving his children with a substantial inheritance. His daughter, with a free woman of color, was included in his will. He left her $5,000 and 2 slaves. When Dr. Louis LaLaurie came into the picture in 1825, Delphine was an experienced and shrewd wealthy woman. LaLaurie arrived from France with a mission to start his physician practice of destroying hunches. He was basically a chiropractor, straightening crooked backs. And in 1826, one of Delphine's children needed some help being straightened out. Henceforth, the romance began. LaLaurie was an older woman at 38, with 2 dead husbands, 5 children, and considerable wealth. One could speculate a few scenarios around their blossoming relationship, but one thing we know for sure is that Madame Delphine became pregnant with Dr. LaLaurie's child out of wedlock. 5 months after the birth of their son, Jean-Louis Léonard LaLaurie, Dr. LaLaurie and Madame Delphine were at a notary negotiating their marriage contract. Delphine was now worth $66,389.58. Once their property and finances were sorted out, they headed over to St. Louis Cathedral to make it legal in the eyes of the Catholic Church. However, it has been discovered that the date of their marriage was rolled back 6 months. Having a child out of wedlock would have been frowned upon in their circle of high society. The 40-year-old Delphine was now on her 3rd husband, and the 25-year-old Dr. LaLaurie was a new father in a new country with a very wealthy wife. Archived letters written by friends mention that the marriage was not a happy one. They were known to fight, often separate, and then return to each other. Some of these letters begin to make early mentions of Delphine's cruelty to her slaves. In 1831, Madame Delphine LaLaurie purchased the lots on Royal and Hospital, now Governor Nichols, which would become the infamous Haunted LaLaurie Mansion. But their lavish home in the Vieux Carré did not have a happy marriage make. On November 16, 1832, Delphine LaLaurie petitioned the courts for separation from the bed and board of her husband. She claimed that LaLaurie had treated her in such a manner as to render their living together insupportable. She also claimed that LaLaurie had beaten her in front of witnesses. 5 months later, Dr. LaLaurie acquiesced and consented, moving permanently to his newly acquired residence in Plaquemines Parish. On April 10, 1834, a fire broke out inside the home of Delphine LaLaurie and her estranged husband. Through the smoke and flames, an ugly truth was exposed, and suspicions confirmed. The LaLaurie Mansion, a beautiful home, held ugly secrets. Just as within any scandal, the stories and embellishments grew over time. but the immediate reports and eyewitness accounts are horrifying and atrocious. 7 slaves were rescued from deplorable conditions, their bodies covered with scars and loaded with chains. They were taken out on stretchers and delivered to safety at the Cabildo, while a mob proceeded to destroy the furnishings of the home in outrage. Judge Jacques-François Canonge was a neighbor of the LaLaurie and one of the first to arrive at the fire. Some of the early arrivals began to help the LaLauries transfer their valuables to safekeeping in case the fire started to spread from its originating place in the kitchen outbuilding. A few of these concerned citizens began to tell Judge Canonge about the captive bondspeople, prompting the judge to politely ask permission of Dr. LaLaurie to have the slaves removed and taken to safety. It is reported that LaLaurie replied, "There are those who would be better employed if they attended their own affairs instead of officiously intermeddling with the concerns of other people." The gruesome of the LaLaurie victims had these poor people horribly mutilated, with some suspended by the neck and their extremities stretched and torn. Judge Canonge told another judge that when he arrived, he was apprised of there being in one of the apartments some slaves who were chained and were exposed to perish in the conflagration. Judge Canonge, accompanied by a few other citizens, discovered 2 slaves incarcerated whom they liberated. One was wearing an iron collar, very large and heavy, and was chained with heavy irons by the feet, and walked with the greatest difficulty. Days after the fire, it was reported that one of the slaves who had been removed from the residence did not survive, and that bones were excavated from the LaLaurie's courtyard. It was documented that one set of bones were those of a young slave girl that Madame Delphine had chased straight out of a window, allowing the young girl to fall to her death, and then buried her on their property. As unbelievable as the scene was, there are records of letters written years prior by Jean Bose, stating that Delphine had been brought before the criminal court for the barbarous treatment of her slaves, but was absolved for lack of accusers willing to testify they had seen her beating the slaves. Madame Delphine LaLaurie did have one loyal servant on her staff, this we know for sure. Amid the mayhem and flames, her enslaved coachman brought her carriage around, and Delphine stepped into it with complete confidence. The mob was stunned initially. It is said that the angry citizens tried desperately to hold the horses and snatch her from the carriage. Still, the coachman used his whip and plunged the horses forward, escaping the crowd. He drove the escape route and delivered her to a schooner waiting at the docks of the New Orleans Navigation Company on Lake Pontchartrain, where she boarded and fled. When the coachman arrived back, the determined crowd met the carriage and began to destroy the carriage and stab the horses to death. Just as the stories surrounding her cruel and heinous actions towards her slaves have circulated, so have the speculations and rumors on where exactly she ended up. It turns out an American poet, William Cullen Bryant, published a journal that uncovers the mystery for us. Bryant wrote that he set sail for France out of New York on June 24, 1834. He mentions one of his passengers, a pretty-looking French woman, a Madame LaLaurie. He went on to describe the atrocities that she had been accused of, that she had committed such horrible cruelties upon her slaves last winter in New Orleans, adding that her home had caught fire, and in attempts to extinguish the blaze, it was discovered that several slaves were confined, some chained in painful postures, and others horribly wounded and scarcely alive. Madame LaLaurie's reputation had made it across the country. Bryant also wrote that Delphine spent time in Mobile before making the journey out of New York with her husband to his native country. Delphine and Louis eventually end up in Paris, with Delphine's children coming over for extended stays. Louis lived from Delphine's wealth but grew tired of her complaining and left her in Paris as he made his way to Havana. Delphine McCarty LaLaurie died in Paris on December 7, 1849. The prefecture of the Department of the Seine reports she expired at her domicile, but does not specify the cause of death. Letters between her and her children talk about a lingering illness she had been suffering from. It's safe to speculate that she probably succumbed to whatever this mysterious illness was. Even in death, rumors swirled around Delphine. In 1941, claims were made that a mysterious epitaph plate was discovered in St. Louis Hache, one cemetery. The weathered and corroding plate had the words, "Madame LaLaurie, née Marie Delphine McCarthy, décédée à Paris, le 7 décembre, 1842. Records in Paris show that on December 9, 1849, Marie Delphine Machadi was buried in the tomb of the Nota and Noel families, but her body was exhumed on January 7, 1851, to be sent back to New Orleans. The mansion sat in decay and disrepair for the next several years. Almost immediately, the mansion became the scene of ghostly tales, as people reported hearing the tortured shrieks of the LaLaurie's mistreated slaves echoing through the streets surrounding the home. In the 1850s, the mansion was refurbished, but it would never shake the curse of the events that had transfixed the city of New Orleans. Once renovations began in order to restore the home, more horrors were discovered. Skeletal remains were uncovered under floorboards and in the yard. Those who walked past the building often remarked that they could hear the cries and screams of agony coming from within. There were even reports of ghost sightings appearing and then disappearing from the iron-lined balconies. The renovations made it possible to turn the mansion into an all-girls primary school for African Americans. Teachers became concerned that Madame LaLaurie's ghost was haunting the school. Girls were being attacked, bruises, and whip marks, the whip being one of LaLaurie's preferred devices for use on her slaves. We know that young girls would approach their teachers, tears streaking down their faces with their sleeves rolled up. The exposed flesh of their forearms were scratched and bruised. "Who did this to you?" the teachers would demand. The answer was always one and the same: that woman. But these girls were young enough to be probably not aware of Madame Delphine and the devastating tragedy some decades earlier. Moreover, it was unlikely that the teachers themselves would tell 6, 7, or 8-year-olds about the starvation and immoral torture of slaves some decades before. One must wonder if the young girls were playing pranks on each other, or if their claims that some phantom woman had scarred them was true. No memoirs exist from this period, just a scattering of accounts here. Was the spirit of Madame Delphine LaLaurie responsible for the scratches, or was it something else entirely instead? The mansion was converted into apartments. Unfortunately, the previous tenants hadn't left, and they made their presence known. New tenants had confrontations with the previous and never stayed for long. One such confrontation included a resident being attacked by what appeared to be a naked man, bound in chains. Another resident woke to find a dark figure, presumably a woman, standing over a baby's crib. The mansion is home to endless cries, moans, screams, and even phantom footsteps. But it was never just minor assaults and scares, as one man discovered in 1894. The man had lived in one of the converted apartments when he was brutally murdered. His home had been ransacked, as though someone had been searching for something. His death appeared to be the result of a robbery gone wrong. What's interesting, though, is how the man had spoken to his friends and neighbors. He confided in them that he believed he had a demon in his house, a demon who would not rest until the man was dead. Could this have been a robbery gone wrong, or the result of a robber being influenced by the demon in the apartment? Although not everyone believes in psychics or mediums, there was one instance in which someone on a ghost tour happened to be a medium. Throughout the entire night, she had sensed things about various locations before the tour guide even told the story. But at the first sight of the LaLaurie Mansion, the medium sucked in a deep breath. "Such sadness," she whispered as she rocked back on her heels. Pulling out her phone, she proceeded to snap a picture of the mansion. "The bricked-up window," she went on. "That's not where the little girl fell out of." The tour guide paused, simply because she hadn't gotten to the part of the story about the little girl at all. Nevertheless, she recovered quickly and said, "No, you're right. The story goes that Leia fell into the courtyard. As for the bricked-up window, I suspect that someone did some interior decorating, but wanted to maintain the symmetry on the outside of the home." In the next few minutes, the medium experienced such a heavy emotion as the weight had settled down upon her shoulders. She sensed the spirit of a young boy who liked to play pranks on the living, and the spirit of a little girl who was often nervous. "Did she feel any of the helplessness or anger?" the tour guide asked. "No," was the response. In our research, we also found an account of a worker from the LaLaurie Mansion who wrote about her experiences on the house. on a thread about paranormal activity. A few years ago, I was going through a rough patch financially and was looking for just about any job that would pay decent and had flexible hours. I used to work as a housekeeper, and quite honestly, it was something I was hoping would come up as a job opportunity. At that time, I was living in Vacherie, Louisiana, which was kind of far from all the major hustle and bustle that Louisiana has to offer. Lucky for me, a friend of mine told me about a small housekeeping job her boss had mentioned. They were looking for someone to come in 2 times a week to clean the first and second floors of this house that was located downtown New Orleans. To fast forward things a bit, I ended up going down to the place, huge, beautiful French home literally in the heart of NOLA, and got the job. The first day was vanilla. Nothing but work, you know? I did what I was there to do, and as I got ready to leave, I got a whiff of this horrible stench, almost like burnt, rotten meat. I thought to myself, did I forget to take out the trash? So, I ran to the kitchen and the smell faded. I kept checking but couldn't find the source of the smell. After double-checking everything, I left. When I came back the day after, I was on the second floor dusting the parlor area when I heard chains being dragged on the floor. At first it startled me and I just brushed it off as it was probably someone outside. But then I heard it again and again. It definitely was coming from inside the house, so I ran as fast as I could downstairs to tell the other housekeeper that somebody else could possibly be inside. It was only the 2 of us there that day. She just looked at me and told me to mind my own business and keep working. That it was nothing. She was kind of a mean old lady, but I shrugged it off and went back upstairs. Again, out of nowhere, that putrid stench of burnt, rotten meat filled the air. It was very annoying because just like that, it randomly came and went. Some days you'd smell it downstairs, others upstairs. Later on that day, while I was using the restroom, I heard this huge commotion upstairs on the 3rd floor. It sounded like a young girl screaming and a woman chasing after her yelling, "Get in here!" I literally was like, WTF? I opened the door and heard running upstairs, and then it stopped. The yelling, the screaming, everything. I went back downstairs, and at this point I was frustrated and told the other housekeeper what I had just heard. She looked at me and she says, "You never hear anything, okay? It's best if you just go on as if you don't notice a thing." She always assured me there was no one there, that we were fine. Needless to say, while I worked at that house for a whole month, I heard repetition of the same yelling, screaming, and chasing. Other days I'd hear chains dragging and dropping on the floor. The thing that did it for me was when I was taking my lunch break on the 2nd floor and heard a sudden cry of agony and despair followed by the sound of chains that seemed to be coming from the 3rd floor. I panicked, thinking someone was hurt and needed help, so as soon as I was getting up to go get help, I see a tall, dark man with chains around his neck, and just like that, I ran out of that house as quick as possible. I never even told the person that hired me that I had no intentions of returning. I just stopped showing up. As rude as that seems, I could care less. I just wanted nothing to do with that place. Anyway, it wasn't until 4 years later that I had moved away from Louisiana that I returned to New Orleans with my boyfriend on vacation. We decided to do one of their spooky history tours, and I tell you, when I saw that familiar building, my heart sank. Anxiety was building up inside me as the tour guide told the story of the building I once worked at and the horrible, tragic, and malicious things that happened there. I felt sick to my stomach and begged my boyfriend to take me back to the hotel. While I worked at the infamous LaLaurie Mansion, I never knew that history. Heck, I had never heard of it. But after the tour facts and doing my own research, everything I experienced there made sense. It still gives me goosebumps to this day, remembering that day I heard Madame LaLaurie chasing after what could have been a slave girl upstairs on the 3rd floor. I'm almost positive it was her. Also, I will add that the stench of rotten burnt meat could have been the spirits of the many slaves that died tortured by the hands of that evil woman. Thank you for joining us on this spine-chilling exploration of the LaLaurie Mansion. We've uncovered the dark history, the haunting legends, and the mysterious tales that surround this notorious haunted landmark in New Orleans. From the grim story of Madame Delphine LaLaurie to the reports of ghost sightings and supernatural occurrences, this majestic yet macabre mansion continues to captivate the imagination of those fascinated by true crime, history, and the paranormal. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of America's most haunted places, please give us a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more captivating content on haunted houses, true crime stories, and unsolved mysteries. Until next time, keep your lights on and your curiosity alive, as you never know what eerie adventure awaits you next.